I had a friend of a friend call me the other day about his 365 GT4 2+2. It's very similar to this car I have at the shop. This is a 365 GTC4. The difference being that this car kind of looks more like a Daytona. This has the rubber bumper front nose, has the rear seats, which is makes it a 2+2. So when you look at that, that's the that's very similar to a Daytona setup, but at the same time it's a C4. And his car was a GT/4, a GT4 2+2. It looks a lot more like a squared off car. You'll see them, they look like 400s. They're 365s and 400s. Anyway, his problem was he's got an issue with his engine, and I'm afraid it's pretty bad. And what I was trying to explain to him on these engines, 365 GT4s, they're the same displacement as the Daytona, but the 365 C4 and GT4s have this layout, which is pretty impressive when you pop the hood. I mean, it's 6 carburetors, it's wide, it's low, it's flat, but at the same time, it has its own little quirks because of that. First off, service on these cars are a little intensive because when you look at the way the side draft carburetors feed into the engine, to do a valve adjustment on this car, all of these carburetors have to come off. Daytona is kind of like a more classic layout where the carburetors are in the center, and you can do a valve adjustment, take all the valve covers off, and you can adjust the valves. But on this car, valve adjustment requires you take all the intakes off. And I may have mentioned before, on these, the air cleaner is also kind of a little quirky thing. You can't pull the air filters out because inside this air box is velocity stacks for the DCOE carburetors, the side draft carburetors. So in order to get the air filters out, you have to remove every single velocity stack, which there's 6 of them on each side, before you can actually sneak the air filters out, because there's not enough room between the side of the engine and the fairings inside the car. So it really, every time you work on these cars, it can be a little problematic as far as just services. But the other catastrophic issue with these cars is that carburetors can sometimes get a little bit of trash, especially when they're not driven much. And what ends up happening is the needles will get stuck, and you'll get a carburetor that kind of drips fuel down inside when the fuel pump is running. It's trying to fill the bowls up with fuel, and kind of the way a toilet works, there's a little valve in there that when the float moves up to the top, it's supposed to shut off the fuel running to the carburetor so it doesn't overflow. Just like your toilet, if the valve isn't working, the toilet's just going to run and run and run. The good thing with the way a toilet works is that the water coming into your toilet tank will just drain out into the plumbing. But with a carburetor that has a similar setup, when that float doesn't work, the needle doesn't stop the fuel continues to go. It doesn't really have a chance to go anywhere except over the top of the carburetor. Well, with a DCOE, these are side drafts, so when that float floods, it will have a tendency to run down the intake manifold. Now, if you are in really bad luck and one of your intake valves are open, the fuel overflows the carburetor, runs down the intake runner, and then into the open valve and fills the cylinder up with fluid or fuel. Now, generally, and I'm pretty sure this doesn't happen with 4-cylinder engines. If you have a flooded engine and the fuel fills up a 4-cylinder engine, as you crank, as the piston rises and it hits the fuel, it stops moving because the starter is not strong enough to overcome the trying to compress an incompressible fluid. So what'll happen is on a 4-cylinder, I would imagine, it turns over and it just stops turning. Eventually that fuel in the cylinder will leak out and into the sump, and you'll be able to turn the engine over. The problem with the Ferrari is because we have 12 cylinders, oftentimes there is a cylinder that is ready to go on compression stroke somewhere. There's 12 chances of this happening. So if you have one cylinder let's say on the opposite side, that's filling up with fluid and the valve is open, chances are an adjacent cylinder or opposite cylinder may be ready on an ignition stroke. You have to imagine what happens when a compression stroke happens. When the two valves, the intake valve and exhaust valve, is closed, and the cylinder and the piston is rising top to compress it all, and it continues to be forced because the adjacent cylinder is firing, nothing can give. So what happens is the cylinder cracks or the rod bends, and I've had that happen on a C4. So I have a technique that I often do with one of these cars when I first start it. If it's a good car and I know it's in good tune and I know the carburetors are in pretty good shape, I won't have to do it. But I do try to bump the starter to just make sure that I can turn the engine over all the way around as the carburetors are filling, just to make sure that it hasn't filled. And I won't run the carburetors for a long time with the fuel pump running, you know, to prime the carbs, because just to keep from overflowing the float bowls in case one of them gets stuck. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So starting up a car that I'm not sure about, what I usually do is this. Turn on the ignition key, let it turn over, or at least let the fuel pumps run a little bit, not too long. And then what I do is I just slowly bump it over without really cranking it over, to make sure that I'm kind of turning the engine around to make sure that there's no fuel filling up these cylinders. Because if for some reason you crank over this car and there's a cylinder filled with fuel, you're going to either hydrolock the motor, bend a valve, or not bend a valve. What you'll do is you'll bend a rod, and you'll also possibly crack a cylinder. And I've seen it done. So right now, it'll start, and this is ice cold. But what I've done is I've run the fuel pump for a little bit, got the fuel bowls filled, but before they start dripping, if they do drip, this one I know is not dripping, but yeah, it's hard to explain, but man, I tell you, it's scary if you mess up one of these engines.